Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the program. My name is William Hemsworth. It's great to be with you all again. Pleased to welcome back our guest, Gary Michuta. Gary is the author. He's a great speaker, Catholic apologist, author of many great books. Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, The Case for the Deuterocanon is just a couple of them. He's also the host of a great radio show on Virgin Most Powerful Radio that airs every day, Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern, titled Hands on Apologetics. So check that out. And we're here to talk about his book today, our new book released by Catholic Answers, Revolt Against Reality, Fighting the Foes of Sanity and Truth from the Serpent to the State. Gary, welcome back to the show. How have you been?
It's been great. In fact, I've been having some fantastic guests, and actually you were my guest today on my show. So that was fascinating, talking about the prosperity gospel. And
that was a lot of fun, and really I think we just scratched the surface of it. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and there's so much out there to discuss. But your book, Revolt Against Reality, I admit I haven't finished it all the way through, but it's a fascinating book, and this is different than other books that you've written. So what brought this book about?
Yeah. Well, basically, it was brought about by the insanity that surrounds us today. This weird incoherence of just strangest stuff going on. And so, a few years ago, I decided I want to find the deep cause of this, because I know in my other apologetic research, I mean, there were pieces of the puzzle that I knew was influencing society. So I basically, like a murder mystery, you start off with the murder, and then once you figure out how that happens, then you start at the beginning of the book and work your way up. So I worked backwards. I back engineered what I believe are the main causes for today, and trace all the way back to the 7th century, back to the 4th century, ultimately back to the Garden of Eden. So hopefully it makes sense. I think it certainly has a lot of explanatory power if it's true.
Now, all the way back in chapter 1, you discussed the creation accounts and how this was sanity, because God said everything was good and so forth. And you make an interesting comparison between the creation account in Genesis and other ancient Near East creation accounts like the Numa Elish, for example. So why is the sanity of God's plan so important to understanding what's happening today? If that question makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really important because when God creates, he creates through his word, and his word is wisdom. So embedded in creation is wisdom, intelligibility. Things have particular natures. There's a certain order or directedness because of those natures, which is called teleology, right? So things have certain capacities to do some things and not to do others. So fruit-bearing plants bear fruit; they don't bear gorillas, right? Because that's what their natural capacity that God has embedded, in his own creation. And so there's this beautiful harmony in Genesis 1 and 2 of God creating through wisdom, and so all of creation points back to God, in this beautiful harmony. And ultimately, God creates a rational creature with Adam and Eve, and so they live it perfectly in accord with what God created. Because for me, William, the definition of sanity is the degree to which what we know corresponds to what is. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Adam and Eve understood things as they are. They lived in accord with that. So their intellects and will were in harmony with one another. And so, in the beginning, we have this nice pristine harmony between the creator and created. And as you know, the story goes on that there's trouble in paradise, because then the serpent comes and he institutes what I think is the first revolt, the first revolt against reason, and he sows the lie. And it's very interesting, because if you look closely at the lie, I think encompassed in that lie is the seeds for all future revolts against God.
Absolutely. And in that revolt, you discuss how their intellects were darkened. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, because what the serpent basically says is that, you thought God is good, is goodness itself, and he creates everything good, and so what he creates is good. But you know what? God God's will doesn't necessarily correspond to what he is. He could will other things, and so the serpent tells Adam and Eve that he kind of has the inside scoop into what's going on, that God's holding out on them, that he doesn't want them to eat the fruit because they'll be like he is, and knowing good and evil. And I think in that context, it has the sense of determining for yourself what is good and evil,
Right.
and so when they partake of the fruit, they buy into this lie, this what do I want to say, a kind of divine deception. That's what the serpent's trying to sell them, that God's deceiving you, he's holding you back. um, then there's this tear, right? There's and that occurs. So Adam and Eve no longer act in accord with how things are. They've kind of gone off into this fantasy land of the serpent. Their intellects and their will are, like you said, the intellect's darkened because now that that harmony that existed between the creator and creator has been not eradicated but distorted, right? And now their wills have been bent, so it's easier to do evil than good, where before, they were in perfect harmony with one another. And that unfortunately, that darkness, the darkening of the intellect, spread on to their children. So today, all of us, experience that darkened intellect to one degree or another.
Yeah, and so in a way, with that darkened intellect, it's kind of like you said, the seeds of all the other revolts that happened throughout history. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because, you know, as you're reading the book, it pops up here and there, this idea about that God doesn't always act in accord with what he is, that there's this possibility that God's deceiving us. These things, pop up over and over again under different forms as you move through history.
Right. In part two of your book, you discuss the various Christological heresies that happened throughout history. Now, in your opinion, are there any of these heresies that are worse than the others that maybe led humanity on a faster track to different revolts?
Um, no,
Okay.
well, that's each in their own way. It kind of uh, revolts against how things are. But I set it up in my book that the incarnation, of course, is the event in human history, and
Yes.
it's the great unifying event where God becomes man, so the invisible God becomes visible. Material is wed to spiritual, and this unleashes all sorts of revolutions of thought. In that all Christians are united in Christ, and we're united to each other in Christ. And so it's this huge integration within humanity. And so Christological heresies kind of pick at that and shrink back from that, either by denying his humanity in some ways, like in Docetism or Gnosticism, or denying or reconfiguring his divinity. So Gnostics did that a little bit. They saw the sun as a kind of emanation that comes from the unknown God. But later on, you have Arianism, you have
Hmm.
monothelism. All of these pick away at either Christ's true humanity or true divinity. And in a way, each solution, like Arianism, is kind of a step back into the pagan world. You know,
Right.
Same thing with Gnosticism, and in some ways, it kind of sneaks back into this darkened realm where people believe there are many gods and they were all fickle, and you know you don't know what turns the gods will do. We ultimately kind of end up with that. And so, as you know, William, in my book I trace that all the way to Islam, and then Islam kind of starts
Right.
crystallizing some of these ideas within itself. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, or I'll go wherever you want to go.
Well, sure. So, how does Islam play into that? Because I think obviously that's a touchy subject nowadays. But how does it play into that?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's really cool because you know me, I'm a big fan of the deuterocanonical books, and that
Absolutely.
whole era is very fascinating. And in it, that's where Jews were confronted with a Greek culture, Greek philosophy. And what occurs there is interesting because reason and faith kind of fit together in harmony, right? So that you find in the Book of Wisdom and Sirach and writings of Philo, it kind of elevates, clarifies Revelation, and Revelation also kind of illuminates some of the things that were right in Greek philosophy. So there's harmony. When Islam encounters Greek thought, especially Aristotle, it's like a train wreck. It's the opposite of what you find in Judaism. And what happens is there are a couple of reactions to it. One reaction is to embrace Greek philosophy and relegate revelation of the Quran to like a minor position. In some ways, that group kind of mirrors a little bit of Christian thought. You know, it's kind of interesting. But it also it hits the third rail in a number of ways for Islamic thought, you know. And then there's the opposite, the traditionalist, who want to say that reason doesn't apply to revelation at all. And for them, Allah is the will of Allah is not constrained by his nature. So Allah can will anything he wants, okay? And he can and he does all things out of compulsion, so there's no free will. And so Allah could rule that something's good at one time, and he could rule that the very same thing is evil at another time. He can change his mind. And of course, you know, in the Quran, there's abrogated verses because Allah changed things. And once you disconnect that will from the nature of God, there's very important ramifications in this, because then we can't know God through his creation, right? Because creation's arbitrary. It's just whatever Allah wanted to make. Science becomes impossible because there's no rhyme or reason. Everything's done by the will of Allah. And I have a really great line I got from Robert Riley's book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, where he says it's un-Islamic to say that if you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. That it is Islamic to say that if you combine hydrogen and oxygen by Allah's will, it becomes water.
Oh, okay.
See, so there's no intrinsic nature or essences that work secondarily, right? It's all primary. It's all Allah's will. So Allah could produce a flower if you combine hydrogen and oxygen. You know, there's no rhyme. It's all his will, right? So, you know, science breaks down, history kind of breaks down. And it's this party within Islam that wins the day ultimately. And that's the reason why Robert Riley states that Islamic countries are at the bottom of social development. It's largely because this philosophical view has crippled them. And in my book, what I show is that through a political dispute between Pope John the 22nd and Ludwig of Bavaria, that Ludwig kind of gets this intellectuals to help battle the Pope. Okay, William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua. Okay, Marsilius of Padua kind of adopts the Averroes position of that philosophy, the government operates solely on reason, and then revelation just confirms what the government says. Okay, so that means the Pope, his job is just simply to affirm whatever the emperor says. And then William of Ockham, interesting enough, you know, he gets in some hot water in terms of this in the universities. He ends up before the papal court in Avignon, and the poor Franciscans ask him to argue their case before the Pope. And the poor Franciscans were teaching that absolute poverty is the gospel. Okay, so so he had to defend that, and of course, the Catholics and Christians say, well, no, property is good. You know, in the Old Testament, God legislates property, personal goods, things like that. So Occam argues that God can change his mind, and essentially he kind of goes with that irrational party in Islam that God isn't constrained by his nature. He can change his mind. He can will something good, and then the very same thing evil at another time. And so in the Old Testament, he says it's good, but now he says it's evil, right? And Occam, this is a very important juncture in history because Occam's thought gets into the university system, and it begins a philosophy known as nominalism. And the thing is that what matters is the names we put on things. There is nothing that ties things together in universals. So nominalism becomes the predominant school in Christianity as opposed to scholasticism with St. Thomas. And then Luther comes on the scene. And Luther is a thoroughgoing nominalist, although he does have some problems with them. And that gets introduced into Christian thought, right? And if you think of what Luther says in terms of justification, you could see it's very nominalistic, right? Because how are we made righteous with God? It's a legal decree. God calls us righteous, but we're not righteous, right?
Right.
And so once that gets into Christian theology, it turns into a mess.
Right. Now, and to kind of piggyback off of that, your chapter titled The Protestant Revolution, if I remember correctly, you have this interesting distinction between reform and the incarnational essence of the church. Can you elaborate on that? Because I found that fascinating.
Yeah, well, you have to be more specific. I'm trying to. There is an anti-incarnational bent to nominalism, just in general.
Okay.
I mean, even with Luther, the first thing he rejects is the priesthood, the sacrifice of the Mass. It begins a bit kind of stripping away some of the sacramentality. In Zurich with Ulrich Zwingli, right? He tries to divest the church of its physicality, its sacramentality,
Okay.
right? And even Luther, if you think about it, what was the debate over? It was indulgences. And of course, they denied relics too. And relics is very incarnational. It has to do with our unity in Christ. But anyway, so especially with Calvin strips Christianity of sacred time and sacred space. He removes all the icons. Of course, Zwingli was very iconoclastic. He invents religious icons. Calvin gets rid of the calendar. The Lord's Day is pretty much the one holy day. Even Christmas is kind of downgraded. So there's an kind of reductionistic aspect to nominalism. Everything keeps getting reduced. And there's also this anti-incarnational aspect. It becomes, things start moving from the visible to the invisible. And even with Luther too, the historic church, for example, under Luther's arm, in his thought, the historic church kind of vanishes and it becomes just a collection of like-minded believers.
Right. And that's kind of what I was getting at. Instead of that communion of saints, so to speak, it's that, the invisible aspect. Okay. Now, organized religion, sometimes organized religion gets a bad rap. Okay. You always hear people say, I'm against organized religion. But you say in your book that it transformed Western thought, Western society. I guess, how did it do that?
Yeah, well, thank you for commenting on that. That's an area people haven't really probed. Yeah, the spiritual but not religious people, it's like we don't want to organize religion. And so I thought, organized religion saves the West. That's the name of the chapter. And, if Christianity wasn't a physical, tangible, ordered society, we wouldn't be here today, right?
Absolutely,
because there were problems that came up that had the church been otherwise, like a spiritual but not religious, personal, thoughts and feelings or something, we wouldn't have what we have today. So I outlined a couple of them. For example, you have the collapse of politics in the West when the capital of the empire is moved to Constantinople. There's this huge vacuum left in the West. And the only institution capable of just, keeping the the mail going and functioning society was the church. So you have Gregory the Great steps into that vacuum that was created. The spiritual but not religious couldn't have done that. There's also monasteries and hospitals where Christian charity starts using economics of scale to leverage so that they can care for the poor on bigger and greater scales. And this is where hospitals come from.
Right.
It ultimately came from the monasteries. And so just think of it, if it wasn't organized, if it was spiritual and not religious, we would never have institutions like hospitals, right? And then there was the Albigensian crusade as well, where there was a kind of remake of a Gnostic heresy called the Albigensians or the Cathari.
Right.
And they believed there was a material God that created everything evil, that's material, and there's a good God and everything spiritual. And so their view of government was, well, the government has to do with governing over material things. So that means the governments are evil, right? So they actually become seditious, within Europe. And they also, they didn't believe in marriage, all sorts of very destructive things that for medieval society would have wiped out civilized Europe, right? And so it was only because the church was an entity, a visible entity that could step in, help discern who they are, as opposed to just Christians that aren't well catechized, and also the cooperation with the state, they were able to suppress it. And even Protestant historians, like Philip Schaff, says that the cause of the church in this case was actually the cause of progress in civilization. If the church wasn't there to do it, they would have destroyed Europe, right? And then the last one is fascinating because organized religion is important because it gives us oughts or imperatives, things that you have to hold as true and you cannot hold otherwise. Spiritual but not religious don't have imperatives. It's whatever they want it. Well, what happens when we get into the Middle Ages is that these religious imperatives that you find even with the deuterocanonical books, that God has disposed everything according to all things are by measure, weight, and number, right? So that means we can use abstractions to understand creation, that God created everything out of nothing, so that there is a beginning of time, there's progress of time, that time is not cyclical, it's not always repeating, but it's linear. Those ideas were imposed by the church on the faithful. And because of that imposition, we have the beginning of what becomes modern science, right? Because since Christ became man, he takes on materiality, and we can learn about God through material things. Christians are focused on the material world. And with these revealed aspects about creation ex nihilo, God using abstractions, that's the spark that starts modern science. And it's not, and we have to be careful about this because there's geniuses in every culture, right? So China made huge discoveries. Islam did, Greece did, Babylon did. Everybody contributes, right? India does. But the thing is, with this religious ought, it's like taking all those ingredients and combine them into a right way in order to bring about science. So I liken it to, if you're going to make a cake, you can have all the ingredients, but if you don't put the ingredients in at the right way, at the right time, you don't have a cake.
Right.
And it was the imposition of these revealed things in the Catholic Church that gave the recipe to construct what becomes modern science.
Fascinating. So this can be a loaded question, Gary, but how do we get back to sanity?
Well, you read my book. No.
That's the quickest way.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And actually people would argue about that, whether that would actually help. Yeah, how do we get back to sanity? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is understand the deep causes of the insanity we live in today. I mean, you can't really know where your destination leads until you know where you come from, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's basically where my book is. It's just basically a roadmap explaining how we get from where we were to where we are. And actually, this is funny, William, because I finished the manuscript originally on chapter 13, Revolt Against Reality, and the ending was so dark. It was so bleak, just assessing where we are right now, that I thought I can't finish the book this. I have to have some glimmer of hope. So I added chapter 14, which is Reality Strikes Back. And in there, what I do is I show areas where, now this was a couple years ago, where reality is kind of pushing back against this madness that we live in today. And so I give, several reasons for hope. And I have to say, uh, there's some, there's a lot of explanatory power. I can explain a lot of phenomena with this book, but there's also predictive power, because some of the things I point out in that last chapter, thanks be to God, is actually gone further. It seems like I may have hit the target on much of this. So how do we get back to sanity? Well, ultimately, we have to go back to the genius of the incarnation and the church, because Christ established a church. He said the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. The church provides this view of the incarnation as the bride of Christ that includes that great unitive aspect to it. And so, yeah, ultimately, William, what I want to say is that we're on the winning side. Okay, so that's one thing you could
Amen.
take comfort in. Because why? Because we believe in the God of reality, the core of reality. And let's face it, there's no other game in town. Is either something is real or it's
Right.
what else could it be, right? So there's reason for hope that these all these aberrations that are around us will ultimately come to an end. And I think the last man standing will be certainly will be Christ, the incarnate Lord, both head and body, head in the church.
What feedback have you received about the book so far?
Well, it's been it's been positive, and that's kind of worrisome for me. I was actually surprised, but in a way I'm not, because William, as you know, being an apologist, you're a plagiarist. Nothing's entirely novel, although I do have a couple of novel things in the book. A lot of the scholarly work that I relied on is very solid, but the only problem was those sources were so scholarly and pedantic that no one read them, and yet they're so brilliant. So I tried to incorporate some of their findings in the book. So if there's anything good that should be said about the book, it's ultimately because I had really good sources that I used to back up my arguments.
Well, that certainly helps out. So where can our listeners check out the book?
Yeah, you just go to Catholic Answers, shop.catholic.com. It's also available on Amazon and Kindle format, and God willing, there'll be an audio version sometime. I have no idea when that'll come out.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you buy the book, please be sure to leave a review on whatever outlet you purchase it at, because it does help. So, Gary, is there anything else about the book that you want to share before I let you go to enjoy the rest of your day?
Oh, well, boy, there's so much, William.
There's a lot in there. There sure is.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, and I think a lot of the insights is just tracing the path of these ideas, because what happens is, I think ultimately what it is man's attempt to uh, find unity apart from the incarnation. I think that's really the core of the revolt against reality, and its failure. Because there is no substitute for that unitive act of Christ in the incarnation. And it's really cool, because what happens is they're trying to build this Tower of Babel, and some things work, a lot of things don't. So you have to fix the things that don't, and that causes more problems. And then those cause more problems. And then you just run into this weird incoherence that we're living in today. Yeah.
So please make sure to check out the book. Again, it's Revolt Against Reality. Check it out on shop.catholic.com or Amazon, wherever you get your favorite books. And then check out Gary's website, handsonapologetics.com, and his daily radio show. Gary, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Hey, it's always a blast, William. I love being on.
All right. God bless you and your work.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you.